and bought her first Singer sewing machine in high school to make clothes. She loved sewing and crafts of any kind, but didn't get into quilting until the early 80s, and did mostly table runners and wall hanging. Over the years, she has taken over 30 classes with well-known authored and award-winning individuals to learn various techniques of working with fiber, textiles, threads, and paint. She began making bed quilts when the grandkids came along and was asked to make quilts with a specific theme or design. That's when her creativity kicked in, and she used the knowledge she learned to either create or redesign a pattern to accomplish her goal. She's very selective with her patterns, and she considers herself an out-of-the-box quilter that needs to put her own spin on everything.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody's heard about starting with clothes, which I did, and but there were no quilt shops around, so I grew up in fabric shops, and a lot of fabric shops also had crafts, so I got involved with a lot of crafts, and I did the clothes thing with the household and the kids when they got older, and then I found time in my hands when the kids started going to school. So I started with landscaping. I didn't even think about bed quilts, and quilting wasn't the thing at the time. But I started with Debbie Mum at the time, doing small wall hangings. And they were very plain, and I wanted to do something different. So some of the fabric shops would invite these women to teach a class, and they were well-renowned people. And I learned so many different techniques because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted the landscapes to come alive. So I wanted to learn how to manipulate fabric. And not only use fabric, but use fiber. And I'm used to using a needle. I've used a needle all my life, and it doesn't have to be a sewing needle. It could be a needle felting needle. It could be crochet needle. It could be a knitting needle. You name it, I've used it. The only thing I haven't used is a tatting needle. And I've also used yarns and everything. So a lot of these teachers taught me how to use paint. If I didn't find a fabric I wanted, paint it. Bring it to life or whatever. So you're going to see some of that in some of the landscapes that I've done. And also I've used various other fibers in my quilts, like Tyvek. You paint it, and you heat dry it, and you just manipulate it. And I've used ribbon in mine. I've done a lot of beading, so I've incorporated a lot of different things. So my first ones are landscapes, because I'm not into quilting quite yet, because I didn't get into that until I ended up with grandkids. So I started off with landscaping. And the first one is paddle play. These are the looms on the lake. And Joan Shea manipulated fabric. And this is one of my favorites because we live in a lake. So I used her pattern, and I use a pattern, but I don't stick to just the pattern. I always put my own twist on it. So hers had one loom. I wanted to put two. So that's what I did. And I manipulated flowers so it looks a little bit real. So the second one, I took 6 classes where you paint on fabric. You use just plain muslin or white fabric, and you paint the scene. So I took 6 classes with this woman, and then what she did is she gave you a pattern to surround the scene once you were done. This is one of 6 I've done, and it was difficult for me to decide which ones to take to show you. But this particular one, I liked it because I put my own twist. And what I used is I used binding tape to make the black connect to the bottom part so the witch landed in the pumpkin patch. And that's all my experience using thread play and various other items in order to create the quilt. So that was kind of my own design on the bottom part. And this one was when I went to Paducah with Jean, and I took a class with Kathy McNeil. And this was her pattern, but I kind of added to it. I used Tyvek for the rocks.
Now what is Tyvek?
Tyvek is, it's almost, you know your mailing envelopes they used to use, your white mailing envelopes? You paint it and you use a heat gun on it, and it will crumple all up, and then you can stitch on it. Or you can use dryer sheets to use for trees, which I've used. But you'll find yarn, you'll find Tyvek. I use some of my landscaping information. I added some hills and landscaping. I painted some of the gray of the rocks because they didn't contain what I wanted. So I just added paint to them to give them a little more. I added the boat. And I used yarn against some of the rocks to show it was like the spray of the sea. So I kind of, like I said, added my own twist. So I don't feel like I'm bound to a certain pattern. I always have to kind of do my own thing. And I got into quilting. When I found out I was going to have grandkids. And the first quilt I did for my granddaughter, I did hexes and I did a little bit of embroidery on it. And I wanted to find a long armor. Well, every long armor that I approached at that time said, she's not going to touch it because it's got embroidery on it. They wouldn't touch it. So at the time, I volunteered at the Lowell Quilt Museum. So I asked them, I said, I said, I need to have this quilt done. I need a long armor. So they referred me to this woman by the name of Julia Crosslands. And she was also an appraiser, and she also was a quilter for Gerald Roy. She did all his quilts, for his books, for everything. So I brought this quilt to her, and she did a beautiful custom job on it. So we've worked together for many years on my quilts. So this quilt, what would happen, my kids would come up to me and say, Mom, do you think you could make a quilt for somebody? Well, my son approached me and asked me if I would make a quilt for his son because they had just bought a house. And he said, can you do a Boston Bruins quilt? Because he was playing hockey. And I said, okay. So I couldn't find anything around. So I did a little research, found the colors. And I designed the logo and the whole quilt. So it was a twin. It was a twin. So a couple years later, and then Julie, I took it to Julie, and she quilted it with skates. She did a beautiful job. So a couple of years later, he came to me and he said, Mom, he said, I just got a new bed for Connor. Do you think you could make that quilt into a double bed size? And I said, oh. So I called Julie, and I said, Julie, what do I do? So she said, all right, this is what you have to do if you want me to finish quilting it. So she said, take the binding off, which I did. She said, add as much as you want to it, front and back, but when you do your batting, you need to hand tack your batting to the existing batting. Because if I put it in the machine, it's going to slide all over. So the batting has to be secure. So I had to hand baste the new batting to the original batting. And I gave it to her, and she finished quilting the rest of the quilt. And I entered it into a show which was being put on by the Quilt Museum in Lowell. And before I did that, I called the Boston Bruins manager or marketing person, and I told him what I was planning to do and asked his permission, and he said yes.
Oh, good.
Cool.
And I put black. I work with a lot of black because if you turn it over, you can really pick up the design.
Wow.
On the back of a quilt.
Wow.
So Julie does a beautiful job for me, and that's why I always pay attention to the back. because almost every quilt I make either has something in the back, whether it's a center square, but I always like to showcase the stitching. The next quilt I have is kind of a little emotional for me because I did it for my mom. And today is her birthday. She passed away, but she was turning 100 in 2012. So I wanted to make something for her so she could remember. She was in a nursing home because she couldn't walk anymore, but she was very functional and very active. So I decided to make an album quilt for her. And I designed the quilt. And at the time, I used the fabric sheets that you put through the printer in order to source all of the film, all the pictures she had from her family and from our family. So she hung it on the wall, and this way she'd be surrounded by her family all the time. Now this next quilt was for my son, my older son. And I fell in love with the fabric. It's called Florentine, and I bought it at the quilt show in Orlando one of the first years that I moved down here. And I also wanted to do one with the stars. So I had a book with Bethany Reynolds and others. And so I decided to use the Florentine fabric and do a star quilt. But I wanted to be able to showcase some open pieces so Julie could do her stuff with the custom quilting. So the stars around the end, I did the center part, and then the stars around the end are not a stack and whack. In order to quilt those, or to cut them, I had to use a mirror and cut the mirror image of each of them. So that kept me busy at a quilt retreat for like about a week. But Julie did a beautiful job. And then again, I used black on the back so you could also see the design. And that's a king-size quilt.
What type of thread does she quilt with?
Pretty.
I don't know, ask Mindy. I'm not a lawn. Now I need to tell you that on one quilt, so I had done a quilt one time, and I really think that working with the long armor is really great. Because I had done a quilt at one time, and it's not this one, but it was for the 4th of July. It was a memory, I gave it to the long armor, and on the back of the quilt, she had the history of the U.S. on the back of that quilt. She had the Lincoln Memorial, she had the White House, she had the Mayflower, and I had a white background, so you couldn't see it. So I ended up making a duplicate quilt and put a dark background and have her recreate it. Now this quilt was hard for me to let go because this is what I call my COVID quilt. So in this quilt, we found this pattern. There's 3 of us that do a lot of wool work. And this pattern is done, I have her name right there. I forgot her name, went right out of my head. It's called Round the Garden with Wendy Williams. And one of these quilts was in the AQS show. It was called Home, and it was done by a woman in Dover, New Hampshire, and she did it in wool. Well, when I did it, the 3 of us wanted to do it, and with COVID, since we were quarantining, wool was too heavy, so I used a fabric background, and it was too big to work on, so I broke it into quadrants. So I did 4 pieces. And the inside pieces were following her pattern. However, I changed the 4th quadrant, and I didn't want to do any wool around. So I decided to have fun. So for 8 hours a day, either upstairs or out on my deck by the lake, I worked on this quilt for 5 months. And I put every single thing that I ever learned in it. I have my landscaping, but I used beads, I used silk ribbon, I used crocheted flowers, I did lutridur, the yellow and red tree is lutridur. I used yarn, I did cross stitch, I needle felted the animals in the corner and put them on. So and I did a lot of thread play also on it. So this, it kept me busy for 6 months, kept my mind going, especially you all know that during when we were experiencing COVID. My son wouldn't let us go out of the house, so he'd get groceries, and I just worked on this. So, I love it. No. It's all cotton. There is wool inside it. There's wool, if you look at the 4 quadrants inside, there is wool, and is there wool when I joined them all together, 4 pieces, I covered the stitching with wool. So I did use that, but I just didn't want to work on the whole thing in wool because they had wool. You see I'll leave this here, you'll see the whole thing was done with wool houses around. And I just didn't want to do all that. So I just did my own thing with my landscaping.
Did you say you didn't want to give it away?
No, that's not going anywhere. That's hanging up in my house.
Just like professionals.
Just walk across that. Don't need to talk.
I did. Yeah, I did. I try to do that because I really like to make sure you put labels and everything.